This is America's Roundtable. Visit us at americasrt.com. Follow us on Twitter at americasrt. You can find us on YouTube and Facebook. Like and share. This is America's Roundtable from Washington, D.C., a weekly radio program with leading voices from America and international thinkers representing the academia, business, think tanks, media, and the political arena. I'm Joel Anand, your co-host, joined by Natasha Sardorch, an economist and chairman of the International Leaders Summit. We're delighted to have Daniel Schwammenthal join us from Brussels today. Daniel Schwammenthal is the director of the AJC Transatlantic Institute in Brussels. Before joining the Transatlantic Institute, Mr. Schwammenthal worked for 7 years as an editorial page writer and op-ed editor for the Wall Street Journal Europe in Brussels and Amsterdam, writing about EU politics and economics, the Arab-Israeli conflict, Iran, radical Islam, and terrorism. We extend to you again a warm welcome to America's Roundtable, Daniel.
Welcome, Daniel.
Pleasure to be on your show.
Well, for our listeners, Daniel, could you briefly explain to us what triggered this escalation after a period of 4 years of, relatively speaking, a calm period with what's transpiring in Gaza as well as in Israel?
Well, what is perceived in outside Israel as a relative calm is, of course, almost unthinkable for ordinary Americans, because we see sporadic fire from Gaza, missile attacks against targeting Israeli civilians. But over the last 4 or 5 weeks, this has really escalated. The number of attacks have gone up, forcing, particularly over the last few days, basically about 1 million Israeli civilians to live nearby bomb shelters. 1 million people, Joel. That's about 1/8 of the population of the state of Israel.
Now it seems that the missiles are now targeting Tel Aviv, and as well as the fact that the reports on Friday indicated that Hamas has fired rockets at Jerusalem.
Exactly. What we have seen over the last years is that after the Gaza war, the extremist Hamas and other jihadi elements have been able to rearm and not only in terms of the quantity of the missiles, but also in the quality. They have, particularly from Iran, received long-range missiles that, as you just noted, can even reach as far as Tel Aviv, the population center of Israel, where in Greater Israel more than 1 million people alone live. It's, of course, also the financial capital of Israel. So over the weekend alone, since Saturday, I think there have been about 200 missiles fired, and it was simply impossible for Israel to continue to ignore. Schools had to be closed, families living in fear. And if you live close to the Gaza Strip in Israel proper, from the time you hear the sirens going off when they fire a missile, you have 15 seconds to reach a bomb shelter. Now imagine what that means for old people or for families with children and babies. You have 15 seconds between getting up out of your bed, grabbing all your children and babies, and somehow trying to reach a bomb shelter. No sovereign nation in the world could allow for this to continue. Israel has not only a right to defend itself, it has a duty to its population to put an end to this.
As ordered by Egyptian president, the prime minister visited the Gaza Strip and met with Hamas prime minister in the midst of the escalated conflict between Israel and Hamas. It is showing a policy break from Egypt's ousted pro-Israeli regime. How do you see this situation evolving at this stage?
Well, I think the change of government in Egypt is one of the elements that perhaps contributed to this escalation in Gaza, because the takeover by the Muslim Brotherhood, which is of course a brother organization of Hamas. Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, and now suddenly has an ally in Cairo. And it is quite possible that this constellation may have encouraged Hamas to increase the fire and attacks to such a rate that it must have known that it may trigger and would trigger a response from Israel. But they may feel much more secure now because of this relationship with Cairo. And so traditionally in such situations, Cairo would try to serve as a mediator. Somehow the prime minister went with the idea to Gaza to perhaps also serve in that function, but he presented it, of course, as a solidarity trip to Gaza. And unfortunately, Hamas did not abide by, even a temporary ceasefire during the prime minister's visit, and it seems not to have brought about improvement in the situation.
It's important for our listeners at America's Roundtable to just understand that just very recently, British Foreign Secretary William Hague stated, I quote, "Hamas bears principal responsibility for the current crisis," unquote. And it's been interesting to note that leaders in Washington, D.C., from the administrative side, but also from the halls of Congress, have condemned what is transpiring, whereby the missiles are coming out of Gaza and attacking civilian populations. And the question remains, are we on the verge of an all-out war, whereby ground troops from Israel will have to be deployed into the Gaza Strip to basically de-escalate the issue at hand?
Well, I hope not, because, what Hamas is doing is basically carrying out two war crimes in one. First of all, they are deliberately targeting Israeli civilians with their rockets. That's the first war crime. The second war crime is that they are hiding among their own civilian population, therefore deliberately putting their own civilians at risk when Israel is forced to strike back. And every dead Palestinian civilian is sort of a propaganda victory for Hamas, while Israel's goal is to protect its own civilians and thus goes to great lengths not to harm the Palestinian civilians. It's the exact opposite calculation for Hamas. So going into with ground troops, which may perhaps be necessary, but it of course, first of all, exposes Israeli soldiers to great risks, who have to then operate in densely populated areas and try to avoid hitting civilians, while at the same time trying to identify legitimate targets. So it's an incredibly messy situation. And of course, the outside world immediately, if you recall what happened in the last war, every Palestinian civilian killed is basically presented in much of the Western media as having been targeted by Israel, and the blame for Palestinian civilian deaths is usually blamed on Israel, and the true context of the situation, that it is Hamas that is hiding among its own population and deliberately putting them at risk, is left out. So Israel is usually not given a lot of time to try and find and target and destroy Hamas cells and Hamas military depots. And it's a very, very difficult situation for any Israeli government.
Yeah, it's very disconcerting to note that, when you think about the investment that has been poured into buying weapons and missiles and rockets and so forth, rather than investing those funds into creating jobs and opportunities for its young people in the Gaza Strip, it seems that Hamas and those that aid Hamas are certainly doing this here to escalate tensions, specifically in the region.
Absolutely. Look, Israel withdrew from Gaza more than 7 years ago now. Every single Israeli soldier and every Israeli civilian has left Gaza. And if you perhaps recall, what happened is that a group of Jewish philanthropists, both from Israel and from the United States, bought some of the greenhouses that of those Israeli settlers and presented them as a gift to the Palestinian people, as sort of a goodwill gesture, but also, a nucleus for employment and the economy. And the first action of the Palestinian was to set those greenhouses on fire. Mm-hmm. And instead of then presenting to the world, look, we now have sort of sovereignty over one part of Palestine. We're going to show the world we are, a responsible leadership. We're going to try to build a Palestinian state based on good governance, on jobs, economy, and doing good for our people. They did exactly the opposite. They used Gaza as a launching pad for missiles against Israeli civilians and forced then Israel, after Hamas took over from Fatah in a sort of violent coup in 2007. At that time, what Hamas did basically, they were throwing Fatah members from the tops of high buildings. That's how they dealt with their own people. And since then has fired rockets against Israel. This is a situation we are faced with. They are holding their own population basically hostage. And the Palestinian people, in many ways, are the first victims of their own regime, which they sort of, in a democratic election, put into government. This is a sad situation that you're not dealing with a leadership that is interested in developing their own economy or providing for a better future of their own people. Their mindset is focused on hurting Israel. And if it means hurting their own population even more, they don't care.
Right. Daniel, is there an indication of why now, this timing of unprovoked attacks on Israeli civilians? And also, how much do you think Hamas can count on Egypt, since Egypt has its own ailing economy that they have to deal with? There's also sizable segments of the population that really are not happy with Muslim Brotherhood's sudden rise to power. And also, they don't want to alienate international backers in the US and Europe. Because they count on them to help revive the economy with loans, investments, and trade opportunities.
It's very hard to understand at the time why they chose this particular time. Some people speculate that they wanted to sort of divert attention from Iran, with which Hamas, at least until recently, used to be very close associated and received a lot of money and support. What has happened is that there are jihadi elements in the Gaza Strip that are, if you so will, if it's, hard to comprehend, but they are perhaps even more radical than Hamas. While perhaps certain individuals in the Hamas leadership may perhaps prefer sort of a more calmer situation there. They are also now competing with jihadi elements, some of them linked to Al-Qaeda. So there's now a sort of a competition going on between who is more radical, who is more anti-Israeli. And certainly Egypt has to be very careful. You rightly said, on the one hand, they sort of feel close to Hamas. They the family connection, Muslim Brotherhood family connection. On the other hand, they are also, they must be worried, and certainly the military must be worried about developments in Gaza and developments in Sinai, which is now Egyptian territory after Israel returned it in exchange for the peace treaty. And here too in the Sinai, we are seeing more and more jihadi elements entering and Egypt sort of losing control over what's going on in Sinai. And some of these jihadi elements obviously are working hand in hand with Hamas and other jihadists in Gaza supplying arms. I think that Egypt, to a certain extent, can give Hamas some sort of diplomatic cover. But in the end, they will be alone. Egypt is, I don't think, will not go to war for Hamas, and so they have to fight it out alone now. There's no way a Western mind can even begin to understand the logic of Hamas or jihadists. Again, I must underline, the sort of normal philosophy of governance and providing for your society doesn't seem to really enter into their political ideology. They have a completely different worldview and different goals. It's sometimes very difficult for outsiders who would think, well, they should have an interest in sort of stability and calm. The Emir of Qatar was just there promising hundreds of millions of dollars of investment. Now they are starting a war that will, again, cripple their economy even more. So, but unfortunately, we are not dealing with people that follow the sort of rational mind of Western policymakers.
Right. Daniel Schwammenthal, we thank you so much for joining us from Brussels, and we certainly wish you well in your most important endeavors and look forward to keeping in touch with you as these developments certainly have raised great concerns in capitals across Western countries.
Thank you, Daniel.
You're most welcome.
This is America's Roundtable. Visit us at americasrt.com. Follow us on Twitter at americasrt. You can find us on YouTube and Facebook. Like and share.